Well, today I wish I was there in person so we could all avoid being two-dimensional, and in my case, previously recorded. I'm in Portland, Oregon, on the west coast of the United States, so I can't be there with you live. Today I'm going to discuss some events that happened in Portland last year and are at the crossroads of three things I'm very interested in. The first is public space, the second is after dark space, and the third is protest. I'll be giving context into the events, looking at several themes, and considering a couple of questions, and moving forward. The work is titled Portland Nightly Protests, Changing Public Space, Property, and Protests During a Pandemic. Just to provide larger context, here's a map of the United States and most of its territories. On May 25, 2020, a police officer murdered George Floyd outside of a convenience store in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Police officers were called to the scene after Floyd used a $20 counterfeit bill at a nearby convenience store. What made this killing of a black man different were the multiple videos capturing the events in real time and close enough to hear his pleas and the exchanges between bystanders and the police. Videos depicting the 8 long minutes of Floyd being forcefully pinned down to the ground before his death began widely circulating online in the following days. 4 days after the killing, on May 29th, outrage grew to protests across well over 100 cities. Various events marked the first several days of protest, including die-ins. These emulated Floyd's position on the ground for the same length of time as it appeared in the video. Many towns and cities also saw violent clashes between police and civilians and the destruction of private property, including Portland, Oregon. The picture at the bottom left-hand corner was taken the morning of May 30th, just after that first night of intense protest on the 29th. Most events began during the daytime and bled into the after-dark hours. The nighttime narrative commonly appears in reporting as, in cities across the United States, tens of thousands of people have swarmed the streets to express their outrage and sorrow during the day. That has descended into nights of unrest, with reports of shootings, looting, and vandalism in some cities, as reported here in the New York Times. In Portland, the night of May 29, 2020, saw large-scale citywide protests and vandalism of downtown businesses, including high-scale shopping center located mere blocks from the administrative heart of the city. Here is Portland, the city, on the left. As you can see, much of the geographical area of the city is situated to the east of a body of water, the Willamette River, that runs through the city. The city's downtown is located on the left bank of the Willamette and is highlighted in orange. On the right, we zoom in to the downtown area and the site of the downtown protests. The light blue square outline gives even further context into the area and indicates the zone that was fenced off at the beginning of the protests. This indicates 16 square blocks of the city at the core of downtown. Over the next 105 days, one of the epicenters of activity was at and around 3 park blocks in downtown Portland, forming a temporary newly reorganized urban common. The surrounding area of these public parks and plazas played a key role, since nearly all of the adjacent buildings are centers of government operations, including policing, on the city, county, and federal levels. The site at the heart of downtown offers a large venue, and the buildings surrounding it provide a direct object of protest. Property ownership of buildings and parks plays an integral role in these events, as they dictate access rules, policing authority, and control. Property encompasses 2 things here: property itself, physical and tangible, and property rights as provided by the state. In this case, ownership as a means of control stretches beyond the binary of public and private. It results in further complications by different government ownership types between federally and locally owned spaces. Ownership of these protest spaces became especially significant since on July 4th, the then president initiated deployment of federal entities to protect federal property in these protest spaces, particularly in the northeast building of the U.S. District Court. Ownership ramifications of federal property of Terry Shrunk Plaza in the U.S. District Courthouse extended to include authorized use of force. They denied access to space such as the adjacent bike lanes and sidewalks on that very basis. The U.S. District Courthouse in particular was boarded up and the entire city block around it fenced off, using a double layer of steel fencing and concrete barriers. No other site in the protest zone had this level of physical divide. The double barrier lasted for over a year, well after the daily protests in the area had stopped. The federal government's ownership of the southern park block of Terry Shrunk Plaza had constant implications for on-the-ground protesters, including sporadic closures of the park. Furthermore, no camping tents or makeshift services by volunteers to use the park throughout the events. The acute differentiation of access and control between city ownership and federal ownership gives reason to reassess the idea of contemporary urban commons under the American capitalist ownership model and demands further exploration. Over the course of events, we encounter many tactics used by both policing entities and other state entities to control the events. By creating a timeline, I made an attempt to create some color-coded themes and parcel out some of the patterns regarding the state and policing entities' reactions to the protests. We began with marking May 25th, the killing of George Floyd, and the aforementioned first night of protests on May 29th that coincided with major protests in 100 cities. A major turning point came the following morning as city and state politicians reacted and the city's mayor enacted a curfew. At the bottom left of the slide, you can see a screen cap for my own personal phone from May 30th, 4 p.m., reading, Emergency Alert, Portland curfew in effect 8 p.m. tonight to 6 a.m. tomorrow, citywide. The curfew meant that people were not able to be out unless traveling to and from work. This is especially interesting following over 2 months of stay-at-home orders due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The curfews had a different weight to them. The month of July was the height of protests, beginning with a large crowd and a clash with police and declaration of riot on the eve of the 4th of July. The following day, then President Trump deployed federal troops to Portland, and things got even more heated. As nights passed, more and more protesters walked over to the area, and as night fell, in a routine of speeches, chants, and some marching, was routinely followed by escalating clashes with federal forces, often using CS gas. By mid-July, several thousand protesters would gather at dusk, including multiple identifiable groups, and the narrative of the protests included Black Lives Matter rhetoric, as well as considerable pushback against federally deployed troops and a local versus national conflict over the depiction of events as protests versus rioting. By the end of July, the governor of Oregon announced she had struck a deal with then Vice President Pence to remove federal officers, although they did not leave the city altogether. As protests continued, a new pattern of weekend daytime protests from counter-protesters created a weekly conflict between the two sides, which was criticized in local media as police chose to minimally interfere, if at all. By the end of the month of July, one such weekend showdown by opposing protesters ended in a deadly shooting several blocks north of the site in downtown. A lot of my thoughts around protest in the era of COVID were around form. While the broad recommendation of 6 feet distance between people was in full effect at the time, in both indoor and outdoor settings, it was clear that many of these gatherings had spontaneous elements to them beginning in short notice, continuing with an unknown number of participants, and also associated with movement through space. So what would protests look like during COVID-19? On the top right-hand corner, we can see an image from a protest in Tel Aviv earlier that year in April. This is one of the only protests known where people were socially distant and the setting was set up beforehand for a socially distant protest, devoid of movement. On the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the protest in July in Portland. People are much closer in together, they're less organized, there's no distancing, yet almost everybody in that picture is wearing a mask. And you can see many of them are also wearing helmets. Other things that came up during and because of COVID were masking, as mentioned, and behavior of consuming water and food. So as you can see in the picture in the left bottom, a lot of food was distributed throughout this time. And thinking about how bodies coincided in that space was always complicated. So thinking about some of the themes and kind of the reoccurring encounters that I had was the recurring use of fencing. It's a physical barrier that restricts access and use. It was used in multiple scales and ways. Initially, the 16 city blocks were fully fenced off, and towards the end of June, tactics had shifted, and fencing was used around a single city block. However, the federal courthouse had nearly permanent fencing surrounding the entire block. And later, all three parks were fenced off multiple times, often citing repair and emergency park closure. A year and a half later, the two city-owned parks to the north are still fenced off, without their usual bench seating, and no new grass has been planted as of yet. The pictures on the right-hand side show fencing around all three parks during mid-July. This fencing went up several days while the city removed some street furniture. In my paper, I quoted Williams' article from 2008 claiming that After Dark space has rules and policies distinguished from daylight, including heightened activity, control, and access to spaces. After Dark space offers essential opportunities as a transgressive setting, especially to oppressed members and groups, to counter existing social and political structures. And I couldn't agree more. From these events, we learned that much of the police activity, apart from several distinct situations of clashes between daytime opposition protesters and Black Lives Matter protesters, and a sporadic arrest on site, the vast majority of escalating events, including declarations of unlawful assembly and rioting by police, were after dark occurrences. This seems to further support the claim that After Dark is a setting for further control of the state and by the state and its entities. The picture on the left shows an art installation that was placed by anonymous persons overnight in front of City Hall, just across from Terry Shrunk Plaza. The two figures on the right bottom show declaration of riot by police over 100 nights of protest and confirmed use of tear gas over the same 105 nights. The visual displays of gear and dress framed a recurring nightly visual representation that was both visible on the ground in the protest and captured in pictures and on video. During July, at the height of the protests, some groups actively sought recognized visual cohesiveness, such as the moms group wearing white or yellow and the dads wearing orange. Uniforms and healthcare worker scrubs were also seen often. On the other hand, for many, the lack of identification was the objective. Masking began as a precaution against the coronavirus. However, in clashes with police authorities, masks, in multiple forms, protected from dispersal tactics such as tear gas and provided a visual barrier of anonymity for protesters. The use of gas masks during the protests has practical value, but may also hold a status symbol signaling of the late-night crowd. Individuals wearing gas masks signal a readiness to face police or other policing forces and familiarity with what had become a nearly nightly ritual by mid-July of a declaration of unlawful assembly or riot and the use of tear gas. The late-night crowds had other physical symbols of belonging, including shields, helmets, and leaf blowers, often ascribed to the older male members of the protests. Thinking about the visuals of after-dark protest, the use of light as a contrast to darkness has been employed in numerous ways over time by mass gathering. We can envision candlelight vigils, holding up a lighter, and for the past decade or so, holding up a phone's flashlight to create multiple light points, joining together in darkness. Over many nights of protests, we also saw video projected as speakers stood in front of the Justice Center, as you can see on the bottom. Setting fires to such things as porta potties, dumpsters, and on occasion a flag were an ongoing occurrence, by which few garnered some attention from the masses, as can be seen in the middle image. All of these images were taken during the same week, in late July. Considering nighttime protests must include conversations about the role of public space at night, its role in democracy, and simultaneously its place as shelter and its use value amongst complicated structures of power and authority, such as with the different policing exhibited in Portland over the summer of 2020. Further analysis of the right of belonging in these contexts and through racialized lenses, especially regarding the events following George Floyd's killing, is required in further discussion of these matters. Quickly thinking ahead, I've identified several areas that demand further insight and exploration to fully understand the complexity of events. There's a need for more case study research linking after dark and protest in urban public spaces. We need to build on not only historicized history and its ramifications that are persisting narratives, but instead also learn how contemporary issues fall into place, including technologies, climate change, and even the changing design and use of open space due to the global pandemic of COVID-19. Thank you all for your time, and hopefully this sparked some ideas and questions. My email can be found at the bottom of the slide, and I would love to continue this important conversation. Thanks again.
Well, guys, in case that you have any question or if you have any suggestion, I'm sure that she will be absolutely happy to receive your comments, your critics, or your notes on this regard. Once said this, I think that we can move forward with the in the room presenters. So, Begoña, I will give you the scene for yourself. Go ahead. We cannot hear you.
You cannot hear me?
Now it's working.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Nice to meet you here. My name is Begoña Aramayona. I'm currently working at the FISNOVA Institute of Université Nova de Lisboa. I'm a member of the Elix Night network, coordinated by Dr. Giordano. And today, first I would like to apologize because apparently now I'm allergic to almonds. Yesterday night I ate some almonds, and this morning my face was literally like a balloon. So I had to go to the hospital very quickly, and this is not the best version of myself. I would like to say this. I mean, meantime, I'm kind of worry about the situation. So I ask for forgiveness. I would like to share with you my let me see. Can you see the presentation?
So far, it's a black skin. If you can move the slide.
Yeah, let me think it's okay. It should be.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So today I'm going to present this work that I entitled "The Informal Nocturnal City as the Scapegoat of Global Pandemic," in which I will try to summarize some questions around this idea of the informal nocturnal city before, during, and after the pandemic. I would like to say that this presentation is a continuation of a previous one that I made last year in this international congress as well, in the first version. And that time I presented some questions in the form of a research proposal around the governance of informal nightlife being built in South European cities. This proposal was presented as a Marie Curie research project that finally got successfully, happily received funds to be implemented. So it will be conducted from 2022 and the next 2 years, and in collaboration with Dr. Valeria Meta from the University of Leicester and other recognized lighnologists like Giordano that I said before. So I share with you this not only to celebrate this good news, but also to ask for collaborations in case you might be interested in some of the topics that I will talk about today. I'm open to this networking, and I would be very happy. So in this presentation, the main argument and the core argument of this presentation is that what we call the informal nocturnal city was already the object of many punitive and criminalizing policies before the pandemic, and that this tendency has been intensified by the pandemic. And this has been done by using specific public policies made during the pandemic that negatively affect informal nocturnal actors, but also how these informal nocturnal actors have been described by public discourse in moral terms that are crossed also by sanitary terms because of the pandemic. So this adds another layer, another dimension of problematic dimension of this previous criminalization that they were living. Indeed, we also think that this recriminalization of the informal nocturnal city during the pandemic has been useful to distract public opinion from other critical aspects of the public management of the pandemic. So this is maybe something that will appear during the debate or in other presentations, so I will just leave it there, but I would like to say this beforehand. It's not working. Sorry. Should be moving, but it's not passing the slide. Okay. Sorry about this. Yeah. Okay. So can you see it like this? Although it's a little small, but can you see the presentation?
Can you do a zoom to the slides?
Okay. Let me see how can I do it. I don't know why, but my computer is running very slow.
Begoña, you can create a PDF version and then you can open the PDF.
Okay.
Maybe it's easier.
Okay, let's do that. I don't want to spend much time on this. Sorry for this inconvenience. Yeah. Let me see if I can do it like this at least. Can you see it like this? Just to be efficient with the time and not.
Yes.
Time is okay.
Fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. sorry about this. So I was saying that we think that this recriminalization of informal night during the pandemic has been useful for strengthening the neoliberal city. And in other words, that's what we want to say, is that these informal nocturnal actors and the practices have been used as scapegoats of the global pandemic crisis, and that involves a multiple and diverse set of actors and practices. Today, I'm just going to focus on 2 cases in one city, although the main project will involve other Southern European cities such as Lisbon and Rome. But today, I'm going only to focus on Madrid. And in the case of 2 types of street precarious workers, that's the case of street informal or precarious vendors and sex workers. I know, well, what we mean by informal nocturnal cities is something that might be asked by other participants, and I don't have much time to spend on this, but I would like to say that we are using Robert Shaw's terms on the nocturnal city, and we are adding this dimension of the informal, because we think that the informal, what is labeled as informal is important in order to analyze in these nocturnal studies, and there is a lot of debate of what informality means. But if someone is interested about this, we could talk about it more during the debate. What they share, these precarious nocturnal workers, is that they are often transnational and racialized migrants who conduct survival strategies at night, and in order to survive, basically. And what they usually find is the surveillance and hard hand and zero tolerance policies of local, regional, and national governments. In the case of the manteros, which is the name that is used in Spain to call this a specific type of informal street vendors, manta literally means the blanket. So mantero means someone that puts the blanket on the ground in order to sell stuff, very diverse stuff, such as shoes, t-shirts, perfumes, and so on. And they used to do this in very central spaces, in the case of Madrid at least, where many local and international visitors used to go around. So that's the case of manteros. They usually are people coming from Senegal, obviously under unregulated conditions. That means with no work permits or living permits to live or work in the country. In the case of lateros, which is another type of informal nocturnal actor, these are lata in Spanish means can, like a can of beer or can of Coke or whatever. So latero is the guy, they are usually men, coming from Bangladesh, in the case of Madrid, who sell cans of beer during party hours in central spaces. Well, what they normally find, these 2 types of both manteros and lateros, are the surveillance, as I said before, and many police persecutions when they are doing their activities, their job activities. And what is very problematic is that the risk of being catched by the police is not only the commission of their things and the application of an economical sanction, according to national and regional vending street laws, but also the risk of being arrested and deported to their original countries. And they also, because of the application of national immigration laws, And what they also usually say, following testimonies of these people, is that police abuse is very common. So during these persecutions, they also suffer from physical aggressions and other type of abuses. Because of all these situations, they created in Madrid and also in other Spanish cities like Barcelona. In fact, Barcelona was the first case that was replicated in Madrid. They have created popular unions in order to defend their rights and defend from police persecution and police violence. It is called in Spanish Sindicato Popular de Manteros y Lateros. They work together in order to defend themselves as a collective. And there was in this process a very milestone moment in which a Mantero, a guy, died because he was being persecuted by police from a central area of Madrid, and he was running away with other mates to Lavapiés, one close neighborhood, which is where many of these guys live. And during this persecution, he suffered from a heart attack and died in the streets of Lavapiés, of this neighborhood. This was a very delicate and sensitive moment because many of the friends who witnessed the persecution and witnessed the whole incident said that the police wasn't helping to help this Mame Valle was his name. But instead they were blocking. They were not helping to be solving the situation in Robert. And so literally they say the police killed Mame Valle. This was very problematic because after this there was a huge battle in the streets of Lavapiés. Many of the friends from the Sindicato Popular, from the Popular Union, but also many other transnational migrants living in the neighborhood, and also many activists, because this is a very left-oriented, activist-oriented neighborhood. They started a battle fight with the police. They were very, very angry. They were crying by the death of Mame. But they were also complaining about the whole institutional racist system that allowed not only the death of Mame, because it was like the peak of the iceberg of this situation, but the whole suffering of transnational unregulated migrants in Madrid. So after this, there was also a very a legal battle because some people from the local council and also some members of the Popular Union of the informal vendors tweeted some messages saying, different things, but the thing is that they have been recently accused by some police unions of enhancing hate discourses against the police. So one of the two persons that were now in this legal battle has been finally absolved, but the other one, which is a Mantero, a formal vendor himself, is still waiting to the response of the regional court. So, this is kind of the situation before the pandemic. What happened after the pandemic or during the pandemic is that, of course, these people were unable to work as they used to be because of the decrease of tourism, of course, because of the lockdowns and the privatization or all what happened with public space and how to use public space during the confinement, and also because of the closure of the formal nightlife industries. They have been unable to do what they used to do. So they have implemented different strategies to survive during these months. But what is happening now is that after the intense year of the global pandemic, now that we are like coming kind of to the normality, normal situation again, they are again suffering the whole institutional punishment against them. So let's see what happens. I don't know if I have time, but I wanted to just briefly talk about the case of the street workers. Sex workers have received different institutional and legal treatments in Spain, depending on the region. In the case of Madrid, the global overall approach has been again criminalize their activity, especially when these activities perform in public spaces. So in relation to street sex work, many local regulations affect the performance of this activity, allowing the police to displace sex workers from urban spaces considered to be sensitive, and sanctioning clients and sex workers. Around 2017, the sex workers union was created again. It was called Otras, literally the others, and it's composed by 600 sex workers demanding the regularization or decriminalization of their activity. The union was described in the formal procedures to be recognized as a formal labor union, but unfortunately its inscription was cancelled by the Ministry of Labor, led by the Spanish Socialist Party, with the argument that prostitution can never be recognized as a formal job. It is worth it to say that although there is a progressist government at the national level in Spain, composed by a coalition between the more conservative Spanish Socialist Party and the more young and left-oriented party Podemos, the overall approach toward sex work coming from this government has been based on an abolitionist approach. That means an approach that kind of equates any type of sex work with sexual exploitation, and that maintains a troubled relationship with sex work unions and grassroots. So during the pandemic, there was a particular and polemic move toward this abolitionist direction, with the implementation or the design of the national law on sexual liberties, which is now being very criticized by sex workers because it strengthens the jail, the penalties against clients and proxenetes, and they say that's something that is, of course, going to affect themselves. The sex workers themselves. So I think I'm running out of time, so I will just go to the conclusions. I would like to say that there is a complex legal framework that involves regulations on the local, regional, and national that is affecting these informal, precarious actors, such as the national immigration law and the national security law, which are also implemented against them. And these regulations are not specifically about how to govern nocturnal hours, but indeed they are affecting actors that are doing their activities during nocturnal hours or after dark hours. And that all these legal and administrative framework, what is finally in the end doing is displacing these informal nocturnal actors from central spaces to the peripheries or outskirts of the city. So this double tension between criminalization and hyper-regularization sometimes, and sometimes under-regularization of the night, I think it depicts a complex picture in which the state sometimes is very present and sometimes is kind of retracts to let them do. But in any case, I wanted to share with you some of these reasons, some questions of what all this picture how it will be after the pandemic. And I think this is something that we are all worrying about. And well, I hope some of the information that I shared with you today it could be useful for your research. So thank you very much. Let's keep in contact, and thank you for letting me participate.
Thank you, Begoña, for your participation. It's absolutely quite interesting and quite sensible, the topic. Now, I would like to invite to Peta Wolifson to share the screen. Begoña, you have to stop. Okay, brilliant. Peta, this scene is yours.
Good. Okay. To start with, I want to acknowledge that I'm coming tonight from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So my name is Peta Wolifson. I'm an urban cultural geographer and I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Sydney in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning. So my PhD, which I finished in 2018, was a study of Sydney's nightlife and its governance during the period before and during the controversial regulations that became known as the lockout laws. Central to these was a 1:30 a.m. nightlife venue lockout and 3 a.m. last drinks that were implemented in the inner area of Sydney in 2014. So since that research, the lockout laws have been repealed in January last year, but just 2 months. After that, the city's nightlife was shut completely for a pandemic lockdown for several months. It then reopened before shutting down again for what's been around 4 months now, but will be reopening next week. So public health and the economy have been shared focal elements of the public debates around both these contested interventions, lockouts and lockdowns. And I wanted to start with this slide, which gives some idea of the moral panic that had arisen in the lead up to the lockout laws, and then the far greater concern around the economy that emerged in the early in the pandemic, despite the significance of this public health issue. The lockouts emerged in response to 2 violent killings of young men in King's Cross in the nightlife precinct in Sydney, and business closures and ongoing economic struggles of venues dominated the outcry against the prolonged lockouts. For lockdowns, debates have centred on protecting the public's health and minimising economic damage. These 2 elements played out very differently in these 2 public debates and in the policies that emerged alongside these debates. So in my discussion tonight, I'm drawing here on my work focusing on the performances of resistance by 2 key anti-lockout groups in Sydney. We know from the work of Hay in New York, in the nightlife context, among others, that social movements struggle to gain traction in efforts to challenge the neoliberal status quo, and forces of gentrification as a critical example of that. In response, we've seen a growing consideration of institutional responses to activism and to opposing viewpoints of diverse publics more generally. Recognising, as Michael Glass has put it, that the city is constructed through the dynamic interplay of calls and responses, I've drawn on performativity theory to interrogate the effective relationships between activists and governments and policymakers in particular in engaging with discourses of economy and public health, among others. Within this is a focus on state reactions to challenges against it, and the negotiating and disciplining acts that arise from these challenges, often performed through modes of engagement. So examining the strategies and tactics of Keep Sydney Open and Reclaim the Streets, I undertook interviews with campaign leads as well as analysed their submissions to the lockout inquiry and other publicly available media. In tracing the procedural journeys of these acts of resistance, I also conducted interviews with relevant city and state government policymakers. Keep Sydney Open was central to the anti-lockout pro-nightlife response in Sydney. Against a seemingly immovable policy stance by the government, the group's strategy became one based around engagement with the government as well as strong marketing in order to capture a wide base. This approach extended to making strange bedfellows across the political aisle of both those in Parliament and of members of the public as their supporters. Government rhetoric espoused that the lockout laws as a public health intervention were required in spite of the economic impacts. Behind this rhetoric, however, was likely economic motivation, stamp duty or property transfer revenue being on the rise and peaking in 2016-17 amidst soaring residential property prices, making up an increasing proportion of the state's tax base. While many nightlife businesses suffered from the impacts of the nightlife lockout laws, the economic harm was not evenly felt, particularly when considering property developers and the casino, which conveniently sat just outside the lockout affected zone. Business closures leading from the lockouts were an intentional expectation of the regulation by the government, particularly in King's Cross, where they identified an excess of venues, or at least venues of a particular type. And so this somewhat blunt policy instrument, also referred to as a circuit breaker, was not accompanied by economic cushioning for those venues and the associated industries and workers affected. In contrast, the government provided substantial economic supports for individuals and businesses during the first lockdown in the form of JobKeeper, which paid businesses to hold on to their employees and paid employees to stay home. The government's protecting lives and livelihoods mantra, however, was not equitably applied. Among other groups missing out were the many cultural economy employees employed on a freelance or short-term contract basis, which was a lot of them. During this time, many with an established full-time career in the arts were receiving around half the amount in government payments that, for example, a student who had been working 1 or 2 nights a week in a bar prior to lockdowns was receiving. This gap was one of several oversights in the initial implementation of the support payments that was never remedied in the months of its implementation. In aiming to maximise their policy impact in response to the lockouts, Keep Sydney Open strategy was to use language targeting the government's own and existing nighttime economy planning, as can be seen on the slide, which compares quotes from their submission to the lockout inquiry and the City of Sydney's nighttime economy plan, each of which mirrors classic global city nighttime economy frameworks. Keep Sydney Open's strategic focus then meant both the critiquing of the lockouts on the basis of the government's stated goals for it, primarily as a safety measure, and proposing policy shifts that related to the government's own economic imperatives. Keep Sydney Open's submission to the lockout review reads as clearly targeted towards the policy as was framed and sold, focusing on questionable positive impact on public safety, a rebuttal of the government's selling of the lockouts as a health measure, and economic impacts. Keep Sydney Open's submission does not pursue a strong argument relating to cultural and social values, particularly when compared to the economic impact discussion. By constraining the discussion of impacts within the bounds of the nighttime economy, they instead focused on consumption and individual personal choice over any substantial commentary on cultural and social benefit. In this vein, the first line of their 19-page submission quotes a legal finding that stated, "The voluntary act of drinking until intoxicated should be regarded as a deliberate act taken by a person exercising autonomy for which that person should carry personal responsibility in law." They also cited the popularity of an article entitled, "Would the Last Person in Sydney Please Turn the Lights Out?" that undoubtedly played a significant role in the momentum of the anti-lockouts campaign, reproducing a public discourse of an overbearing paternalistic nanny state, one that re-emerged in the so-called freedom rallies in response to COVID lockdowns. A key point to make in relation to Keep Sydney Open's submission is their intentional avoidance of using unquantified data, a decision that only cemented their economic and public health foci, but one that the response to their submission in the review showed was somewhat justified. While Reclaim the Streets shared Keep Sydney Open's goal of removing lockouts, their performative tactics differed substantially. Social and cultural impacts of the laws were concerns front and centre, alongside and tied to access to public and civic space. Interview quotes shown on the slide, carried through in the group's public rhetoric, were concerns where concerns over venue closures are framed particularly with reference to loss of public space and minority community concerns, emphasizing the importance of significant spaces, particularly for certain vulnerable, marginalized groups for whom they provide connection and counter discrimination. Diversity emblematic of that typically destroyed by the gentrifying strategies of neoliberal nighttime economy planning. Reclaim the Streets provided an alternative to the narrative then pervading about venues as a key contributor to alcohol-related violence by instead presenting nightlife venues as places of safety through community and places through which vital support networks are built, a point that seems even more critical now in the midst of lockdown. While legitimate issues of mental health and domestic violence were raised by COVID lockdown opponents, these tended to be utilised alongside economic arguments. Genuine experts in those fields, when raising these issues, generally called for greater consideration and planning for these concerns within lockdowns, rather than opposing them altogether. Changes to lockdown restrictions, such as the singles bubble and more recently the friends bubble for school kids, reflect an acknowledgement of the importance of these networks, particularly for some vulnerable groups. At Reclaim the Streets, street parties or protestables, the casino and developers were key targets. At their third in March 2016, a sculpture of a giant feces was placed on top of the star sign outside Sydney Star City Casino. The Mike Baird Memorial Turd, as it was named, after the state premier at the time pointed to the stink of corruption in the casino's exemption from the lockout. While both Keep Sydney Open and Reclaim the Streets have addressed the exclusion of the casinos from the lockout zone, the latter focus more on the systemic context of special treatment. The government response to Reclaim the Streets was mostly ignoring them, and the New South Wales government policymaker I spoke to gave what I'd call a willfully confused description of them and claimed they hadn't been forthright about their agenda. The absence of attention to the cultural economy by the government is common to the Sydney's lockout and lockdown experiences. The prevailing view of the redevelopment of King's Cross, as captured on the slide, is one of normative acceptance of the diminution of cultural plurality as a result of lockout-led gentrification and nighttime economy planning. And I should note here that the lockouts were maintained for an extra year in King's Cross after they were removed elsewhere to cement the effects there. To simplify Keep Sydney Open strategy to one focused on nightlife venues to the detriment of the cultural economies that take place there would be to ignore the inextricability of these elements. And indeed, the cultural economy has not been entirely absent from economic discussions around nightlife planning. And I'm looking forward to hearing tomorrow from Garcia-Ruiz, who is examining more current nightlife governance efforts in Sydney. It's clear, however, that the profound spatial impacts of policies such as the lockouts and lockdowns quite purposefully benefit other areas of the economy, construction being one example, while allowing elements of the cultural economy to suffer. And the discretion that we see increasingly play out in governance is also quite clear across nighttime economy planning instruments. So this is not simply a case of over-governance of nightlife by any means. And while I don't have the time here to discuss, there are important punitive geographies that have played out spatially through lockouts and lockdowns and along class, race and age lines. So finally, challenges against lockouts and lockdowns reflect both individual and collective motivations. Challenges observed are also seen to engage in different ways with wider and long-term discourses relating both to the economy and cultural economy, to public health, including mental health, and conceptions of the right to the city. Not least, there are bookmarks here in the enduring narrative of the undue influence of capitalist forces in the governance of the city. Still resonating, albeit more faintly, are more productive and inclusive discourses that we should help to amplify so they can still be read in the landscape of our future cities. And a key part of this work, I think, is the doing as well as advocating for the research, often qualitative and ethnographic research that illuminates the diversity of our cities at night. So I look forward to the rest of the conference, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Peta. What an amazing work on Sydney's and Australia's review. So now I would like to ask to Florian to take place and take the stage.
Okay, so you can see the PowerPoint?
Yep, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So I would like to present the presentation Night of Potential Resilience of Student Festive Events in Montpellier facing COVID-19. So it's part from a research program that is named Smart Nights. It's a research program about nightlife in intermediary cities. During this research program, we had to challenge with this health crisis. So to introduce the purpose, there's something about the qualification of the COVID-19 health crisis. So in France, in order to manage the health crisis produced by the COVID-19 epidemic, the government operated under a specific state of health emergency regime between March and July 2020, then between October and June 2021. In fact, this emergency regime also raises the administrative authority to take measures such as restriction related to the freedom of movement, the administrative closure of establishments, house arrest, or the ban of public assemblies. So this legal status has already been mobilized in the recent socio-political history of France from a security perspective, in particular during the Algerian War, during the conflicts in New Caledonia, or due to riots in certain priority areas of the city, or the risk of terrorist attacks. These measures have deeply transformed the geography of urban life. Rather than allow regulated and controlled form of nightlife, the 8 months of national curfew have eliminated any possibility of legal nocturnal activities. Crucially, this has deeply affected how university students experience the urban night. In public discourse, young people have often been depicted as irresponsible, and they were accused to promote the circulation of the virus. In fact, the introduction of a disruptive element such as a virus can produce a crisis which may be qualified subsequently, whether it be political, social, economic, or else. Transformations of a configuration are highlighted by the attempt to manage a disruptive factor of this configuration, indicating that flaws or failures prevent the resilience of the system, meaning the capacity of integrating the disturbance in order to reconstruct itself in an acceptable way for the functioning of the systemic configuration. So the periodicity of these moments of crisis can lead to questioning the term crisis, consisting rather of a turning point, of a particular oscillation or recurrence, therefore a reason. There is a differentiated time and the duration to be qualified, as well as breaks and resumptions. Consequently, the time of the clock is only one of the parameters to be taken into account, different from the quality of the rhythm, of its perception, and of the overall movement towards becoming. This perspective leads us to analyze the situational redefinitions of rhythms according to confronting value system and refers to the question of identification and therefore of symbolization. So we have questioned this effect of COVID-19 in the city of Montpellier, that is an intermediary city. This is the capital of the Hérault department in southern France. It's located on the Mediterranean coast, but developed towards the hinterland. City has experienced an important demographic growth between 1962 and 1915, when the population increased from 123,000 to 283,000 inhabitants. And in the greater urban areas, there are around 400,000 inhabitants. The significant urban expansion of Montpellier was during the second half of the 20th century, with the important North African and Spanish immigration leading to the construction of inexpensive buildings to house newcomers, and to the restructuring of services such as local universities, in connection with the national policy of democratization and massification of access to higher education. Montpellier is therefore a dynamic city in terms of demography and urbanization. Its population is culturally and socially heterogeneous and rather young, with a third of local population between 15 and 29 years old. At national level, we have only 17% of this age. Once nicknamed the Sleeping Beauty, Montpellier is now perceived as a dynamic, attractive, and young city. However, precariousness is also important, showing great local disparities with an unemployment rate of 13% of working people that can work. In Montpellier, urban nights have long been a blind spot for seeking and urban spaces. In fact, they have been the object of both security policies, such as urban police, public lighting, video surveillance, etc., and marketing strategies around celebrations and heritage in particular, with little regard for everyday practices. So the city considers privileged development policies and events for capturing flows on capital. However, beyond certain spaces dedicated to nightlife, the municipality of Montpellier is therefore not developing a coordinated strategic night vision. As one actor said to us, he said, we never really asked the question if there wasn't an emergency. The attractiveness of the Écusson, that is the historic center district, is linked to its nightlife with the presence of customers from bars, restaurants, theaters, and opera, which creates a dynamic. But in terms of specific arrangement, I don't know, if not except for street lighting. So there is a very different geography of night policies in Montpellier between a center which is taken into consideration in a development strategy and the outskirts in which the night is not considered. We made a fieldwork to address this question. First, we carried out a sociological survey during the initial lockdown, so during March and April 2020. We questioned 668 students on their model of festive consumption. We had 6 questions that dealt specifically with ways of experiencing lockdown. So the sample is composed mainly of students declaring to be biological female for 3/4 of them. However, there are only 60% of female students in Montpellier, indicating a bias at the sample level. And less than half of the sample is made up of students aged from 1920 and the third age from 21 to 22. Then we conducted semi-structured interviews during the period of partial restrictions, that's in mid-end of 2020, and with students selected in this sample from the questionnaire. So we mobilized 13 interviews, led with 8 female students and 5 male students. To select them, we made up ideal tips of revelers on ways of partying, based on the analysis of the responses from the sociological survey. So we questioned those who came closest to an ideal type in order to obtain a diversity of relationships with festiveness in Montpellier. The interview guide focused the discussion on the geography of festive practices in relation to the daily practices of each one, the various stages of the reveler carries, the social interactions and nocturnal sociability, the organization of festive events, and the relationship to psychoactive products, as well as social norms and representation. Finally, we carried out very short directive interviews during the last 50% lockdown period, so the curfew in March and April 2021. We relied on the respondents to the sociological survey by interviewing those who agreed to share their contact details so 73 respondents. In order to situate the specific context, we interviewed several stakeholders in the local nightlife. These analyses were extended by a systematic watchfulness carried out both in the local press and in social networks, in particular for economic stakeholders such as bars and discotheques, and the follow-up of work meetings carried out at the national scale between nightlife stakeholders. So, as a result, we have one result about the adaptation of Montpellier students to the initial lockdown. So all the students interviewed appreciated the exceptional nature of the health context. Students experienced the initial period of lockdown in a mixed manner for a third of them, and more than a third are satisfied. These results correspond to the national study conducted by the Observatory of Student Life. More than half of the respondents found that they missed nightlife with a score of 7 to 10 out of 10, and less than a third found that they did not miss their nightlife with a score of 1 to 4 out of 10. So students that were enjoying their life since the introduction of restrictive measures explain it through the ability to adjust to the new situation. The students with a mixed opinion put this period into perspective by comparing their situation to other students who are more isolated. Two students, usually very pretty girls, also took advantage of this period to make a break from their intense party life during the studies and stick on their lifestyle. So most of them had to give up non-school activities that take place during their free time, so sport, association, leisure, etc., or try to find alternatives such as video conferencing. The students therefore mobilize social networks or online gaming platforms to stay in touch with their friends and try to hold on together. So the students' relationships to festiveness was transformed. We saw many initiatives on the side of nighttime consumers, more or less accepting the fact of not being able to party as before. It seems reasonable to consider at least a form of psychological resilience. This is integrating the disturbance to rebuild themselves in a socially acceptable way. The aperitif windows have multiplied in the initiative of inhabitants, municipalities, or venues. As social distancing and confinement have produced new night atmospheres in the city, with calm and darkness, the virtual world has grown. Social ties have multiplied, often ephemeral. However, the lockdown has really changed the way of life of students. The professional activities of the students were also affected by these restrictive measures, which accentuated the precariousness of some of them. In our survey, during the first lockdown, the bedtime hours during the week were close to those of the weekend outside lockdown, with a slightly larger lag at the weekend, showing a more diffuse temporality, partly because of the absence to face-to-face distance, which could have disrupted the rhythm of life. In terms of consumption of psychoactive substances and sexual relations, the overall trend of students was decreasing during the first lockdown. Questions then arose more specifically about the few students marginalized during this period, characterized by an increased consumption of psychoactive substances. This could be explained by the feeling of being on holiday and the feeling of loneliness. Indeed, the hospital addictology services have been able to note an increase in consumption among the most vulnerable in Montpellier. Conversely, consumption may have decreased for the less vulnerable in order to protect their identity due to the change in social frameworks. The second result is about the in-between two lockdowns that was lived in half shade. So since June 2020, the bars, the hotels, and restaurants received the administrative opening authorization. During the lockdown, the sector tried to innovate, but the economic difficulties worsened with an estimated bankruptcy from 20 to 30% of the establishments. So during the summer period between the two lockdowns, some students still decided to not participate in nightlife activities due to the fear of the various or future penalties. However, with the gradual reduction of the uncertainties concerning the health risk, students gradually relaxed. The pressure on the atmosphere of the city was perceived in a more positive way. The first post-containment observations made in the city indicate the massive return of citizens to the public space in the name of conviviality. So beyond digital territories, parties organized in apartments rented for the occasion or not, and clandestine parties organized in abandoned space, such as urban wastelands, other students have moved into public space to face the restrictions and create big gatherings among young people. Some have participated in free parties, such as Technival in August 2020, with an audience of around 10,000 people, with an average age of 30-35 years old. So it's not fully corresponding to student audiences that can usually be formed. However, several stakeholders noted significant repression of these events since this Technival. The uncertainty concerning a second wave of contamination has led local authorities to reorganize public spaces, to respect spatial distancing, and to develop preventive health measures in terms of social distancing within leisure establishments. So we had a health protocol that has been made compulsory by the Ministry of Health, but the public space, usually dedicated to kids, has been invaded by tourists and dedicated to pedestrians, creating intense nocturnal atmospheres. Municipalities are therefore worried about the impacts for residents in terms of uncivic behavior, leading the government to stigmatize youth on the festive practices of students through a regime of fear, prohibiting university integration events for newcomers. And the last result is about the curfew. Because we had an announcement of a curfew, both with the administrative closure of leisure establishments that was open to the public. The curfew was difficult for the students to live with, reducing the festive life to its strict minimum. The benefits perceived by some students during the first period of lockdown have faded for the majority of them. More than 3/4 of the informants found that they missed their festive life with a score of 7 to 10 out of 10. Their dissatisfaction is mainly related to the perception of a loss of liberty in relation to their urban experience and social life, which leads them to the impression of living in a monotonous way, of missing out on something, of a wasted youth. This creates a feeling of frustration, especially for those who do not legitimize these measures, which they believe are ineffective or even a source of stress due to the obligation to respect the time constraints imposed. This feeling of loss of freedom is badly experienced due to the perception of the future as uncertain. So a good part of them even broke the rules to keep going out. Thus, almost 2/3 of students went to other people's homes or received people at their home to do parties despite the curfew. But a third adapted by moving their parties before or after curfew. However, even the students who broke the curfew did not go out very often, less than once a month for more than a quarter, and from 1 to 3 times a month for a quarter. The students tend to go out on Saturday and Fridays, then Thursday, such as the usual party days. The students finish their evening after curfew, so they broke the curfew to return home. These transgressions were facilitated by weak police control, according to the students. Only 3 out of 73 students said they were controlled once or twice at night by a police officer during the curfew, and none received a fine, which encourages them to go out. However, a quarter of the students indicated that they remain on the alert, preparing a derogatory exit certificate which could be falsified. Consequently, the lack of legitimacy given to the curfew, which was not intensely monitored, articulated with the need to meet up with friends, encouraged students to break the rule, the students have integrated justification regimes shared between peers. So to conclude, this contribution analyzed how the university students living in the city of Montpellier have adapted their night leisure practices to the recession miseries adopted to contrast the spread of the COVID-19 influence. The results have shown how the curfew and the administrative closure of nighttime establishments have deeply affected the nocturnal leisure practices of the university students. In terms of management, public authorities have to deal with a growing uncertainty due to flexible behaviors. Without being the consequence of a disorder, the uncertainty of the context and of individual leads to the renewal of forms of regulation linked to collective projects. This is a disturbance of the traditional urban order. However, the perception of crisis, these shortcomings of laws to be corrected, makes it possible to innovate in terms of networks of devices to return to an acceptable systemic configuration. So the phenomena of crisis overlap with each other and between local and global scales. So leaders' authority diminishes due to the multiplication of negotiations between partners, including economic and institutional partners, in an increasingly complex system of interdependence between administrative levels. In this context, the management of the health crisis linked to COVID-19 sheds light on the flaws in the social and political configurations of the forms of management of urban nights. These oscillations in the nightlife, rooted in the management of this health crisis, can be read at various levels, various timescales, in terms of simultaneity, succession, duration, and present, past, future, giving to see an order of succession of initiative, which can also be simultaneous between a diversity of stakeholders and towards a future to be defined, the night as a common good. Thanks.